Hi, I'm Todd Gannon, and this is the SCI-Arc Channel. I'm here today with Amale Andraos, the Dean of the Columbia GSAPP and co-founder of the firm WorkAC based in New York. Amale, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Todd.
You were going to talk to us, among other things, about the idea of the book. I guess books have a long history in architecture. Things like Palladio Londinensis and Vitruvius Britannicus. And at that period, before schools had been formalized in the universities in the 19th century, much of architectural education was informal and kind of learned on the fly. So Thomas Jefferson, for instance, kind of learned architecture from books like Gibbs's Book of Architecture.
I think what's interesting is that books like architecture never die, even though we keep declaring their death. I remember when I was at OMA and the Seattle Public Library was going on, the big question was, why are we building a library, at the kind of moment of the death of the book? And in fact, the book keeps transforming, and really in the same way that architecture is transforming. And let's say the books of the last two previous generations, which were always intended to be sort of manifesto-like, to declare a project. My project is scale, my project is form, is density, events. I'm part of a generation who said, well, maybe we don't want a project, maybe we want to engage in a practice and sort of work through a body of work. And I think we're starting to see books emerging which have a certain thickness without having to declare a sort of, singular project. These books still have a voice, even though it isn't kind of a manifesto. And what kind of voice is that new voice, which is more like the body of work, something that is kind of worked through.
I'm thinking to books like 49 Cities, for instance, which clearly has a sort of didactic intention to it, and also has a very clear graphic attitude, that you take 49 very different cities, some of them actual, some of them not, and render them through equivalent graphic techniques.
I just published a new book co-edited with Noura Akawi, who is the director of Studio X Amman, Colombia's global network. Architecture and Representation, the Arab City, and it's kind of questioning the persistence of certain kinds of meanings in what is being produced in the Middle East. And I agree with you, 49 Cities actually was a moment of declaring a kind of line of inquiry for the office. And the Arab City is a way to think about global practice, kind of theorize it and look at it from a sort of historical perspective. But it may be that the body of work and this kind of research are parallel rather than in the way that the work used to seem as a kind of demonstration of a sort of manifesto. And there's a kind of space between the two. The indirectness and the space in between is maybe an interesting space right now.
Taking on this kind of didactic material from the position of the architect as opposed to from the position of a historian, I think is a very different thing. And maybe OMA, your background there had something to do with that, because I think Koolhaas as well, the Harvard project of the city books, for instance, which similarly had that kind of, they were not historical overview. They were, it was not a scholarly undertaking. It was much more a use of the medium of the book to attack design questions in a way that maybe you couldn't do so as directly through a project.
Right. I think that's a very important point, and I would put learning from Las Vegas and Rossi and absolutely Collage City. I think to write as an architect is, and I keep telling the students, architects, we need to write again, and we need to draw again, we need to write again, and not leave writing only to historians and scholars. I think there's a kind of space where the architecture is a form of knowledge that includes design, can sort of open up new lines of inquiry.
But if you go back not very far, it was, all of the architects with a project, as you say, all the architects that had a manifesto wrote like crazy. You think like Venturi was writing as an architect, Eisenman writing like crazy as an architect, Koolhaas, the list goes on. There's something I think is a little bit, our generation, kind of educated in the 90s with the kind of digital turn, that somehow the writing fell out, or that our attention as we entered practice
Yes.
took up different problems, and that we're now kind of circling back
We're
to writing.
circling back. I
Yeah.
think it's a moment where there is some desire to circle back. At least that's what I'm hoping for, and that's what I see. We collaborated on a kind of second edition of The Other Architect, the CCA show, which is now at Ross Gallery at Columbia, and it's really interesting to look at that legacy of the other architect writing or intervening in the world.
What I like about something like 49 Cities, for instance, is that it has a sort of quickness and lightness to it. Because the format is so consistent, you're able to make connections
Right.
between projects in a way that would be very difficult to make with the original. So it's important that you redraw
Right.
all
Absolutely.
of the plans, for instance.
Right.
At the same time, there's a certain flattening effect. You know,
Right.
that I find it very strange that something like No Stop City
Right.
is in the same
Yeah.
category as, you know, Timgad,
Right.
sort of Roman
Right.
settlement. And there are some, I think there are very useful connections that can be made.
And I think this is where we can enter as architects and as design thinkers and as, you know, drawing connections. We can enter these questions from a different perspective.
Given us something to wait for. I know you've got to get on to get ready to give the lecture
Yes,
in a few
we will.
minutes. Thanks very much
Thanks
for taking
so
the time
much,
to talk.
Yes.
And we'll see you next time on the SCI-Arc Channel.
All right, thank you.